Hey everybody, this is Kennedy Hawk from the Marvel Champions Monthly Fan Podcast team. I'm going to do a couple short videos about deck building and different tips and tricks you can use when deck building. I've seen lots of questions on Facebook, Discord, and Reddit about how do you get started deck building, what are some top tips and tricks and things you can do to get technical with your deck building. So I'm going to make this into a whole series with a bunch of different facets. I'm going to start with my favorite topic of conversation, cost curves. So a lot of people ask, what are cost curves? How do cost curves work? Why should I care about them? And I wanted to go through the basics of cost curves, starting with a hero and then evolving into their full deck so you can understand why a cost curve might matter. So I'm going to start by looking at two heroes, Captain America and the Hulk. Two very polarizing heroes. Captain America, who's considered by a lot of people to be very, very, very strong, and hopefully the cost curve of his kit helps us understand why he's so strong. And Hulk, who's considered to be very, very, very difficult to pilot and unwieldy, and I think that's because of his cost curve. We'll then look at some different cost curves for Hulk through Marvel CDB, so you can see what different cost curves can look like, and you can start to visualize like how much is this going to hurt me. I'll talk you through some of the different combos with Hulk and how you can use cost curves to really shape what cards you add to Hulk's hero kit, because that's really going to determine how successful or unsuccessful your deck might be. So let's start by looking at Captain America here. So Cap has lots of resource generation. We're going to talk a lot in this cost curve video about income and expense. So Cap has lots of income. He can reduce the cost of the first hero coming out. He's got 2 super soldier serums that provide resources to him turn after turn. He's got a ton of zero cost cards. Shield Block is a true zero cost card. Fearless Determination is actually like a -1 cost card because you draw a card back up depending on how you're counting for cost. Just for simplicity, I'm going to count the card itself in its cost. So Shield Block technically costs 1 because it's the shield block itself. Fearless Determination truly costs 0 because it's going to replace itself. We've got 3 1-cost cards. So just looking here, we've got 9 cards that cost 3 or less because Super Soldier Serum counts itself, and several cards that cost 0. These shield tosses are kind of like income sinks. You're not going to ever actually spend 0 on a shield toss because it's the card itself and the cards you're discarding. They can actually be some of the most expensive cards in Cap's kit, depending on how many minions are out there. Finally, his kit caps off with a bunch of 3-cost cards. We've got 3 Heroic Strikes, which is an extremely efficient attack. It basically buys you a defense, which is worth some value, plus it's almost worth everything just in damage. And Agent 13, which is just a great ally. So you've got a very low cost curve. You've got 4 cards in the 3 printed or 4 true cost range, and everything else is below that with a ton of resource generators. I would consider both Fearless Determination to be deck cyclers, our Super Soldier Serums, and Cap's ability, all resource generators. Really, really good. On top of that, Cap doesn't really care as much about cost curve as Hulk, and one of the reasons why is he has these income sinks like we talked about. If you draw a bunch of cards that have awkward costs, you can always pitch them to shield toss. If you draw cards and you end up not spending one of them, you can use it for Cap's ability. So there's all sorts of things you can do in Cap's kit to take care of unused cards, because one of the most important things we're going to talk about with Hulk is since he discards cards from his hand, you're not going to be able to hold on to things from turn to turn. And I would argue with almost every hero, anytime you're holding on to a card from turn to turn, you're giving up passive income by not redrawing to your full hand size and seeing your full opportunity. So that's one thing we're going to want to do with every hero, is try to spend every card in our hand. You can only do that if you plan your cost curve appropriately. So when I'm building a deck with my physical cards, not on TTS, what I'll do is I'll lay things out in cost curve piles. So I'll make little groupings, everything that costs 0 to 1. We'll say that the shield toss is probably going to cost on average 2, maybe everything that costs 2, and everything that costs a true or a printed 3, a true 4 here. And then I'll look at the numbers. So I've got 7, 4, and 4. That means a majority of my hero kit cards are in that 0 to 1 range, which is good. It's very cheap. It means I can do multiple things per turn. On top of that, Cap's got a 5/6 hero size. We've also got Steve's Apartment, which draws us cards. All kinds of crazy good stuff. Now let's look at Hulk and talk about why his cost curve might not be as great as Cap's over here. So Hulk does have these 2 resources that give him 3 resources. So those are great. We're going to consider those 0 cost income cards. We really like them. We've got 3 cards that have a printed cost of 1, a true cost of 2. So not a ton, unfortunately. So if we're looking at our 0 to 1 cost cards, we've got 5 instead of 7. Quite a different number. We've got 3 cards that cost 2, and 1 is a resource generator, but while Cap's resource generators can generate resources in any form, hero or alter ego, this one requires Hulk to flip down to alter ego, which is one of the most dangerous things he can do because he's going to have to recover from all that threat that gets placed on the scheme. So we've only got 3 cards in that 2 cost region, and then we've got a whopping 7 cards in the 3 cost region. So if we look at this, our piles are almost reversed. Before we had 7, 4, and 4. Now we have 5, 3, and 7. So the 7's at the upper end instead of the lower end. To exasperate this, Hulk has a hand size of 4, and you can't hold cards from turn to turn looking for double resources or for those Hulk signature resource cards to be able to play things. So you have to draw the right cards at the right time to spend them. Luckily, he does have 5 in alter ego form, and he can siphon his deck a little bit to look for the right cards at the right time, but it still makes it a very difficult thing to pilot. So next, I'm going to pull up 2 cost curves for Hulk, just in a browser over here. So here's 2 examples of cost curves. So first, let's look at a low cost curve. These are both leadership decks I made with Hulk, and I've piloted them both. They both work reasonably well, but they have very different philosophies to how you're building your deck. You can see here in this first Hulk, the low curve deck, you've included lots of 0 and 1 cost things. All of our allies cost 2 or less. Call for aid, make the call, and strengthen numbers all cost 2 or less. Earth's mightiest heroes are 3 basic resources. We've actually not included any cards. Our most expensive card that we've included is Maria Hill. That's pretty crazy. Maria Hill, Squirrel Girl, and I guess Ant-Man or Hawkeye are expensive cards in our deck. And if we look over here, we still have a ton of physical resources. It's not like we're doing no physical resources. We're not fully leaning into that Hulk smash ability, but enough to make our deck pretty reasonable. But we've got 15 cards that cost 0, 7 cards that cost 1. That's 22 cards in your deck that cost 1 or less. And that's really important for Hulk, since you get 4 cards in your hand and you want to fully spend your hand. You can include a lot of 0 and 1 cost cards to get as many things out of your hand as possible. So ideally, you would have 2 1 cost cards. You'd kind of want to have like a giant spike here at the 1 cost, because you spend 1 card to play the first card, spend 1 card to play the second card. But just a low cost curve deck sort of looks like this, right? You've got a ton of low cost things and then less and less high cost things. We don't even have any 4 cost cards because when we're in hero form, we can't afford 4 resources unless we luckily draw into one of our resource cards. So we're not going to count on that. We're going to count on getting cheaper things out. And we do still have some 3 cost cards from Hulk's signature kit to use with these limitless strengths, so they're not completely wasted. So this is a low cost curve. So here is our high cost curve deck. You can see all our allies cost 3 or more. They all have really great abilities on entering play, so we've included rapid responses. We're looking at some pretty expensive cards here. You'll note we didn't even include a ton of leadership cards. This is almost a basics deck. We've got Avengers Mansion, we've got Helicarrier. We did put 1 downtime in because we want to make sure when we flip, we only have to flip once. I put in 3 copies of Enhanced Physique just to increase my physical abilities for Hulk himself and to give myself some income because I have all these expensive cards in my deck. We do still have 3 copies of Honorary Avenger and Earth's Mightiest Heroes because they're just really useful with Hulk. There's no reason not to include them. We definitely want them for people like Mockingbird and Nick Fury to be able to Earth's Mightiest Heroes if you need to. We've got a ton of resources. We even put the power of all of us in here because we've got 3 enhanced physiques. We have a Helicarrier, a Mansion, Mockingbird, Nick Fury, and War Machine are all going to trigger the power in all of us, and we're going to want to play those cards a lot. So just tabbing back and forth between these 2, you can see the difference in the cost curve. One of them sort of has more cards on the lower end and then evens itself out, and one has more cards on the upper end, although not necessarily at 4 because I didn't want to go crazy here, and then evens itself out at the lower end. And they're very different philosophies, right? If you're doing that high cost curve deck, you're going to play 1 thing every turn as Hulk. You're going to hope you have the resources to play the right thing, and then it buys you what you need. A low cost curve deck is going to give you more options. You're going to draw your hand of 4 cards. You might have 4 cards that cost 1 to 0, so you have to pick which of those 2 cards you're going to play, and how that's going to optimize your performance. So I thought I would go through some combos that work within that facet. So this is a sort of 2 cost and 0 cost curve kit. I think this is a really interesting way to build Hulk's cost curve. You include a ton of things that cost 2. So here we have Squirrel Girl, Hawkeye, and Ironheart. They all cost 2. And then you have a ton of things that cost 0. So when you play Squirrel Girl, you're going to pay 2 resources for her. So you probably only have 1 card left in your hand. If it's Earth's Mightiest Heroes, you can use Squirrel Girl to get Hulk to attack twice for 6. That's a pretty good use for Squirrel Girl. She can still thwart the next turn and chump block for you, so that's great. Similar situation with Hawkeye. You can either use this Earth's Mightiest Heroes to ready Hulk, or you can discard it to Hawkeye's ability. And likewise with Ironheart, you're going to draw a card, so you'd have to still pitch a card to Hawkeye or something. But if you've got a bunch of 0 cost cards in your deck, you can hopefully spend cards with Ironheart, holding a 0 cost card back. If you top deck one of these, you can turn Ironheart into an Avenger to use Earth's Mightiest Avengers or whatnot. And there's lots of other 2 cost cards out there, like Lead from the Front and things that you can include in the leadership aspect that work okay with Hulk. Hulk sort of likes 2 pockets of cost. He likes clusters of things that cost 2 and 0, and he likes clusters of things that cost 3. And I guess there's sort of a third pocket in there, clusters of things that cost 1. But when you start intermixing those pools, it makes your cost curve really difficult for Hulk's hand size to manage. So hopefully this makes sense what I'm talking about here. You want to have a lot of things that cost 2 and a lot of things that cost 0, because you want to make sure you fully spend those 4 resources or 4 cards that Hulk's going to draw you every turn. And if you had a ton of things that cost 2 and you just drew all 4 things that cost 2, you're going to only get to play one of those things probably, and you're going to have to throw one away at the end of the turn, which really sucks. If you have a bunch of things that cost 3, same situation, but 2 and 0, pretty good combo for Hulk. So these are some 3 cost cards here, just as examples. So here's reasons why 3 cost cards don't work very well. Let's say we have 4 cards in our hand as Hulk. I want to play Mockingbird. She's a great card, stuns the villain. That means I don't have to defend with Hulk, so I'll get to attack again next turn. Here's the problem. I've spent my entire hand on Mockingbird. So all these 0 cost cards really don't advantage me unless I have some sort of card draw to go with this, like Avengers Mansion or something else. Now we're getting into that high cost curve region. Alright, so the other route that I like to take with Hulk is another version of a low cost curve deck. So I would call this a medium cost curve deck. You got a lot of things that cost 2, a lot of things that cost 0. I would sort of leave out things that cost 1. Like here's an example of why you wouldn't want Stinger in this deck necessarily. Let's say you pay 2 for Squirrel Girl, and Stinger is the last card in your hand. Now you can't play her, and you're pitching her at the end of the turn. So lots of things that cost 2 and 0. The other way to spend 4 cards is lots of things that cost 1. Let's say you have 4 cards in your hand. You spend 1 to play Stinger. You spend 1 to play Morale Boost. So now you've bumped yourself up to 4 attack. Stinger can also thwart or attack for 1, and you've used your full hand to your fullest. The problem here is right now in the card pool, there's not a ton of cards that cost 1, but there are at least a few cards in every aspect that Hulk can use that cost 1 to sort of build upon this strategy of playing out my whole hand, because that's what my hand size can manage, and that's how it synergizes sort of with my cost curve. So what I'm thinking of here is Aggression. Aggression's got lots of cards that cost 1. We have Press the Advantage. We have You'll Pay for That. We have Counterattack. You could even combine a couple 3 cost cards with some 1 cost cards, right? But to remember to be able to play all those things, if you spend 3 resources on, let's say, a Drop Kick, which I don't have pulled out here from Aggression, and then you want to press the advantage afterwards, you're going to have to spend 4 resources to do that. So you're going to get a hand size of 6, which is virtually impossible with Hulk if you're not running some high cost cards. So I think one of the ways to sort of synergize between Hulk's cost curve and between his hand size is to include all 1 cost cards. You'll note Earth's Mightiest Heroes isn't a 1 cost card, but it's really good, so I put it in here because that's the deck I was building at the time, but actually not a deck that works with this strategy. We're trying to include 1 cost cards in our deck that let Hulk use his hand to his fullest. Now that's not always going to be possible. You're always going to have odd exceptions and things like that. Like honestly, if I was playing this in whether it was this leadership deck, this aggression deck, or this 2-0 cost deck, I would probably include a Mockingbird because she's just a really strong card that can take up Hulk's full hand. But Hulk sort of you really need to focus on what you're going to build, and a lot of that is because of this setback with cost curve. If we compare these piles to, so these three piles kind of more or less have to exist independently, right? If you mix a bunch of 2s with a bunch of 1s, you're not going to be able to play them all in the same turn. 3s are going to take up your whole turn, so even the 0s are useless because you've had to spend them on the 3-cost card. It's really hard to intermix these pools. If we look at a hero that has more strength in their economy and within their cost curve, they're going to be able to absorb that a lot better. And yes, a lot of this is because of hand size, right? Having 5 cards in your hand means you can play a 2-cost card and a 1-cost card and have 3 resources to combine these 2 pools. You could also play a 2-cost card and 2 0-cost cards, or a 3-cost card and a 0-cost card. So there's lots more ways to synergize just by having a hand size of 5. But having all that extra economy helps a lot too, and having so many cards in the 0 to 1 range sort of give Captain America that flexibility to decide what his cost curve wants to be. Whereas to make a successful Hulk deck, you really need to think about, well, my hero deck itself is fairly limiting with lots of 3-cost cards. So there's going to be lots of turns where if I play a Hulk card, I play nothing else. So I got to make sure that the turns where I'm going to play an aspect and a basic, or 2 basic cards, that I'm optimizing those turns. And the only way to do that is by thinking about those costs and resources ahead of time. So this was kind of an abstract video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play some games in the near future, probably on Twitch. I might record them, I'm not sure yet. Just using those 2 different Hulk decks to show the different styles of Hulk you can have and how you can make successful combos, but you really have to pay attention to just a few things in the economy of your character. You've got to know what the split of your resource kit is. You really want to know, am I a hero that has a ton of expensive cards? Because then, especially if I don't have a lot of resource generation, I can't afford to have a really expensive deck unless it's perfectly solidified. Or am I a hero who has lots of cheap cards and I can afford to basically throw anything in my deck and I'm going to be able to afford it all? Those are sort of the 2 routes we have right now. There's very few middle ground heroes in that economy or income area. So things that we're learning and things that will open up as we get more cards in the game. Hopefully this introduced some people to the concept of cost curves and what they mean. When you're building a deck on Marvel CDB, you do all this building stuff, you click save. Don't forget, you're going to get this nice cost curve chart. Some of the other things that we're going to talk about in other videos, just for future knowledge, are resource type allocation and how that can shape your deck. We're going to talk about aspect inclusion, hero versus basic versus aspect. So how do you judge when should I include power of, when should I not? And the card draw simulator. So these are 4 tools that are just built into Marvel CDB. There's lots of bugs in Marvel CDB, right? Sometimes it puts things in the wrong cost curve bucket. But for the most part, you can trust it and really sort of understand what is the difference between these 2 curves I built. If I was to guess which of these 2 Hulk decks is going to be more successful, I'm definitely going to pick this low cost curve one because I have a lot more versatility. With 15 cards that cost 0 and 7 cards that cost 1, on most turns I'm going to get to do 2 things. And I can pick the 2 things that are the best advantage to my situation. Whereas if I have all 3 cost cards in my deck, I'm going to be very limited in my choices. So when I'm building Hulk, I prefer to build one of these low cost curve decks because of his economy, and because his limiting hand size and the fact that you want to spend everything out of his hand. Well, with that, I have babbled enough for all of you. Hopefully you have learned a little bit about cost curves. If you have some specific comments on cost curves, especially for Hulk or Captain America, leave them in the comments below so other people can learn your best tips and tricks to deal with characters and sizing up their cost. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to check back the next video when we talk about when to use or not use power-up cards.